Hello and welcome to this recording for the Year 11s for their GCSE revision. I'm Mrs. Summers. Lovely to see you all. Brief couple of caveats before I start. In an ideal world, I would love to have live modelled all of these things to you, but I don't have a visualizer at home. So what I've done is I've tried to make it as authentic as possible. So I've genuinely, when I've been writing these down, when I've been trying out some of these techniques, I've been doing it as if I'm a student doing it. And I'll tell you the timings of how I've done things as we go along. That obviously means I'm unscripted. I've got a PowerPoint in front of me, but I'm unscripted. So if I make mistakes, then do forgive me. I'm rattling along as best I can. And finally, just to say, these are things that I've researched very recently. Since you dear things have left me, as long with year 13, it's given me some time to do some real research and find out about some ideas for revision and how to go about it that I haven't come across before. And these are just 3 things that I picked out, quick and easy things that I haven't come across before. Hopefully they're things you haven't come across before. So I'm introducing you to something new. So I hope they're really useful, but that's enough waffling. And finally, just to say, the aim is 10 minutes, but I know me, likelihood is it's going to be 20 minutes, but we'll see how we go along. We'll rattle along nicely. And obviously, if you have any questions, you can email me at jsummers@jhds.sch.bucks.sch.uk, and, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, let us go. No more waffling, please, Mrs. Summers. So we are talking about, as I say, 3 revision techniques. The number one is so incredibly simple. Maybe you've done this in other subjects. Goodness knows why I've never done this in English before, because it just makes so much sense, particularly when you are in a good way. You've done a decent chunk of revision and you want to kind of evaluate how much you know and consolidate that knowledge. So this is great for memory. This is nothing fancy, all right? You've got in front of you my example that I put together. I did this on an A4 piece of paper. I'd highly recommend doing it on A3 if you have access to that at home, particularly if you're doing it for Macbeth, because you've just got so much information to put on the page. I was really struggling, particularly you can see the Macbeth section. I really didn't have enough room. I put as much as I could get into the small square. But if I'd have had an A3 piece of paper, I would use it. What is a brain dump? It is as simple as it sounds. It's taking the contents out of your brain. It is spilling it all onto the page in a kind of as visual way as you possibly can. All right. So it's not, I haven't looked at textbooks. I haven't looked online. Oh, I've remembered my other caveat. My caveat is I have not gone back to check these quotes. So if you think, is that exactly what the wording of that quote was? Do have a quick look online to double check. Because, there's a few that I put question marks next to because I thought, I think this is what the quote is. But clearly they're fairly, generous in the exam in terms of giving you the credit, but it's worth you, at least looking up the proper one if you think that doesn't look quite right. So do bear that in mind. So brain dump. I'm doing a character one here. You can equally do this for themes, of course. So you could have 6 different themes. You can do this for your language paper. You could do language paper you don't really need one for question 1, hopefully, but question 2, 3, 4, and 5, you could have, a 4-way version and unpack everything there and think about, okay, what do I need to do for question 2? What do I need to do for question 3? Etc. Come up with for question 5, what are all the techniques I can use, dump them onto a page, etc. All right. So this is a really useful thing where you're just throwing everything you know onto the page. And then you can think about how you sequence it, how you make it useful. So in this case, this Macbeth one, I've decided, obviously, all my colors, I'm using yellow to indicate the characters themselves. I'm indicating red or orange, either to suggest a theme or a particular character trait. Oh, apparently I'm 2 minutes into this call and they're trying to get rid of me off the call. That's nice. See, I told you there'd be interruptions. That's a very silly, yes, I'm talking to you, go away. Right, back in the call. Hopefully that hasn't disrupted the recording. So essentially, I've forgotten where I was now. Oh yeah, themes in orange or red. So this is just a really useful way of showing how I've sequenced it. And then the uncolored things are one of 2 things. I've either put quotations, which obviously I've put in little quote marks, or kind of ideas that are revealed. So if I couldn't think of the exact quote, I think it's still useful to think, oh, that reminds me of this. Or I put some little bits of context in there too. I thought, okay, witches, demonology, written by James I in the Jacobean era. I thought, oh, okay, it's useful to know that he had 300 witches sent to their deaths in Scotland. So yes, the the craze around witchcraft is somewhat abated by the time we're getting to the writing of the play in 1606. But James has this past, he has this fascination, so we have to at least take that into account. I'm not saying it's a piece of propaganda as a play. You may have heard us talk about this on the Ask podcast, but I think we have to take that into account. So that's just an example. And I've done a similar thing with each one. And with Macbeth, if I'd have had more room, again, I would have done this more. I've thought about, okay, what are his key scenes? What are his moments that shape him as a tragic hero? Because as we know, we're looking through it through the tragedy lens. So I thought, okay, right, Act 1, Scene 2, battle, perfect warrior culture symbol. He's the archetypal hero, etc. The impact of the witch's prophecies on him in Act 1, Scene 3. Then I'm thinking, oh yeah, the persuasion scene, the way that Lady Macbeth is able to change his mind and attack his manhood, yep, key. His resolution to go ahead with the murder in Act 2, Scene 1, and the dagger that's sort of, coming towards him, and the transformation of his character. And then really, the real downfall from there, his terrible kingship on display in Act 3, his moments in Act 4. What have I written? Oh, more prophecies. I'm trying to read my own writing. See, I told you this is unscripted. So the impact of the second lot of prophecies and the equivocation upon him, and he becomes basically just an outright monster by this point. And then, of course, his downfall and defeat, his doom in Act 5. So that can be a useful thing to do. So really, as I say, really simple method, nothing that's hugely revolutionary. But one of the things I love about this is it allows you to see, where are my gaps? What have I not done? What do I need to go back and revise? What am I missing? What don't I understand? So, I've said to myself, so I've done, if you see down the bottom, a little line to say, what do I still need to know? I feel like I haven't got that many quotes about kingship. So kingship, to remind you, is about the art of being king. What makes a good king? What makes a bad king? This is explicitly explored in Act 4, Scene 3. We're going to talk about this later on in one of the other techniques. But I felt like, okay, I could do with more there. So that's something I'm going to go back and I'm going to add to in my revision. Also, if I'd have done this in A3, what I really should have done was label all of the methods as well, because that would have made it even more useful, because I've deliberately tried to think about quotes that all feel like it's a simile. I can talk about that. Fly, flounce, fly, some use of exclamation and repetition. But it would have been nice if I could have explicitly labeled that if I had more room. I didn't really explore the motif of blood, which I think comes into multiple different characters. So that would have been nice. So that might be something I want to revisit as part of my additional revision. So as I say, this not only helps you memorize, helps you consolidate and find out what you already know. And as I say, don't be tempted to look at Google. That invalidates the whole thing. This is all about, what do I know now? Putting it on the page, identifying what I don't know, and then figuring out what I need to go back and look at some more. All right, it is as simple as that. There is nothing revolutionary about it. Yeah, I just think it's really useful. I'm not going to go through all these, but basically what I've done for you is I've cut it down into the 6 sections so you can see them in nice big writing, so you can have a look at the different bits and at your leisure. But I am going to move on to this one, okay? Visual timeline planning, otherwise known as chronological mapping. Now, this first bit looks a bit scary. All right. Essentially, this has come out of my research from a really amazing teacher who goes under the sort of nickname Funky Pedagogy. She's, taught me a great deal. She's great. And she says, and I agree, like looking back at the examiner's reports, one of the things that students forget is when they're given the extract, and we're really explicitly talking about Macbeth now, clearly, rather than the other ones that could be really used for, any of your remaining revision in terms of language and in terms of Macbeth. And even Unseen, to be honest. Yes, you won't be looking at specific poems, but you can still do dumps of, oh, here's all the techniques I can talk about. Here's the things I must, make sure I appreciate, etc. Anyway, back to this. What the message here is, this technique is all about acknowledging that the extract you are given has a structural significance. Because lots of us are pretty good at talking about big ideas and even themes and even analyzing the language. But it's vital, if you want to get up to the very, very top, you need to understand what is the significance of that extract within the play as a whole. Okay, so what is it for? So Is it an instigator of a new idea? In other words, is it the first time we are seeing something? So the witches, their very first appearance in Act 1, Scene 1, immediately instigates the theme of the supernatural, tells us that there are going to be supernatural influences. They tell us, they're to meet Macbeth. We know that that is the target of who they are aiming at. So we know they're instigating that sense of possibility of sinister manipulation, particularly with thunder, lightning, and rain, right? So if they gave you that scene, you've got that. It's an instigating scene. But equally, you might be given a scene from anywhere in the middle, and therefore it's going to be about what does it develop? How does something grow? So for instance, let's think of an example. In Act 3, we see the development of the increasingly monstrous side of Macbeth. Initially, well, it's wrong. He's usurping, the rightful king in order to become king himself. But then he's considering murdering his best friend, be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck. So if you're getting a scene from Act 3, either one where you've got the interaction between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, or perhaps the soliloquy to be thus, what's the word? I forgot the word. See, this is what happens when you don't script things. But to be safely thus. To be thus is nothing but to be safely thus. Correct me. Something along those lines. But anyway, the soliloquy he gives where he considers the fact that what the heck was the point of this all? He's damned his soul for eternity. And actually, Banquo's descendants are going to be the kings, not his own descendants. And he thinks, what the heck's the point of that? His conclusion is he needs to murder Banquo. But you think about what is the structural significance of that scene. So that, as I say, is developing the sense of the growing monstrosity and the growing psychopathy almost of Macbeth, removing himself from his original kind of character, intensifying that sense that he will go to any means necessary. Obviously, he explicitly lays this out in Act 3, Scene 4, when he says about I am in blood, step so far. There's so many quotes a lot. Basically, Act 3 is this point of there's so much development of Macbeth's character down the road to evil. So you can talk about all these things. You can talk about how an extract foreshadows something else, of course. That's a really good structural term that you can use. You might think, okay, this isn't actually the most important extract in the world, but hopefully it's got loads of lovely juicy stuff for you. But think about, okay, how does it predict and help echo or suggest to something that's going to happen later on? Does it light the fuse for something? I like that phrase, the idea that it sets a chain of events rolling. I know, that sounds more on Inspector Calls, but when we're thinking tragic hero arc, we're thinking, I always think of it kind of as once, they've got their hamartia, they've committed their fatal error, things are starting to go wrong, and it feels like a snowball effect. Everything kind of becomes out of control. So is your extract a sense of the fuse lighting moment that means Macbeth cannot turn back, and it kind of sends off a cacophony of different explosions and outcomes, to extend the metaphor. And finally, of course, you might have something from right near the end, in which case it might be a climactic moment. You might say, well, this scene really culminates in the death of Macbeth himself. Interesting, the most key point being the decapitation of the ignominious decapitation of Macbeth by Macduff, which has a real cyclical echo of the death of the Thane of Cawdor back in Act 1. So, what's the purpose again? What is this the culmination of? If we've been building up to this, what have we built up to? Why is it climactic? Is this the catastrophe point? It's the final moment of Macbeth's downfall. Does it result in something? Does it demonstrate particular consequences? Does it reach a kind of high point, a pinnacle, a zenith of particular characters? That's just another fancy word meaning high point. Or is it a resolution? So it's not impossible that they might give you a section not only of the death, but also the final speech by Malcolm. You could talk about what does that resolve? How does it unravel? Is it, in the denouement, what is revealed? Do we feel secure that Scotland has reached a sense of restoration and that things are going to be okay now? Or do you find that actually the conclusion is more ambiguous? And there's a sense, we've seen various versions I've talked to you about that slightly changed the ending, the Fassbender version, implying perhaps that Macduff might eventually rise up, which I think is very implausible, but there we go. But also I've seen in a staged version at the Almeida Theatre, the idea that Fleance actually might lead some kind of armed rebellion, etc. So there is that sense of, is it a real restoration? Is there a real catharsis? So catharsis, a sense that the audience are, all of those emotions have been purged, the tension is gone, and everything's going to be okay now. Great chain of being restored, natural order restored, no more fair is foul, foul is fair, everything's okay? Or is there a sense it's a tinderbox and that, there's still a Scottish warrior culture, and at any point this could all explode again? So really, to sum up, we're thinking about, and this is really useful for your introduction, right? Clearly, the main role of your introduction is to establish you know what you're talking about. You've really thought about the steer in the question, so what it's steering you towards. I know a number of you found the whole Jekyll mysterious character a bit of a nasty one in terms of the way it was steering you, but you cannot ignore that. Whatever it's aiming at, you need to really think about it, really formulate a sense of what is my central argument, or arguments, of course, you might have several. But within that, you need to have a sentence or two putting this scene that you're given in context, and, at this moment, we have just witnessed the complete U-turn of Macbeth in his resolution. Having said he wouldn't proceed any further, Lady Macbeth has now persuaded him to go ahead and commit the murder of the rightful king, the usurping of the throne, and thus we see the beginning of his downfall as the tragic hero. Something like that. I've just come up with that on the top of my head, so maybe not perfect, but do include that somewhere in your introductions. If you're someone who thinks, what goes in my introduction, that's what it's all about. And this is just a useful way to get you into that. And actually, I've not shown you the actual thing yet. I've only told you about the kind of words. Really, the method I'm looking at is a more visual method of planning, because a lot of you say to me, I don't plan. I do fine when I don't plan. You're always going to do better if you do plan, whether you like it or not. Even if you're just scribbling down a few words, that is still immensely important, just those few words. But if you're a visual person, or you're a person that, needs something to really guide you, I think this is a really useful method. All right. So this is just a timeline. This is encouraging you. Now, clearly you may not, I've put Act 5, Scene 9. They're not expecting you to know what is in every single scene. All right. You need to know roughly what act things are in and what comes before what, but you're not going to know exact scenes. But if you are, for instance, in this case, my question has asked me something to do with kingship. So, how does Shakespeare present the theme of kingship in this extract and the wider play? All right, something like that. And that is entirely possible that could come up, guys, because that is not really something that they've properly explored. Okay, so what I've got two. You can see above the line and below the line. Below the line are the stuff I'm coming up with myself. And this is revision at this point. So this is something you can do at leisure. And to be honest, I could have done this in a lot more detail. But I'm thinking kingship, where is that relevant? Okay, where is that relevant in the play? And each one of those little scribbles is just representative of a scene. All right, you can just do a square, but it just represents the idea of this is this particular scene. So my first sort of acknowledgement of kingship in the play is Duncan's display of kingship when we're shown his goodness and kindness and generosity, but also his naivety. So that would be, and I might add the quote there, he was a gentleman on whom I built an absolute trust. There's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. So I'm going to jot down a brief summary. This is kind of brain dump again, really. Brief summary of why I think this is a significant scene, and then a brief, maybe a quote or two. Act 1, Scene 7, I want to say. Then I thought this is important when Macbeth is kind of reasoning himself out before Lady Macbeth comes in. He's reasoning himself out of going ahead with the murder. When he says we will proceed no further with this business. He talks about Duncan as having silver skin, like the idea if he kills him, his silvern skin will be laced with his golden blood. This incredible, this idea of this inherent majesty of Duncan, that he is the rightful king, the anointed king, has with him all these connotations of wealth and luxury and so on, and goodness. You know, there's all this association with lights. That's just a really lovely quote. Not one I would focus on the whole scene, but it's just an odd quote that just struck me. Act 3, huge number of plays. We've already talked about to be thus is nothing, but to be they safely thus earlier. But Naught's had all spent the idea that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, they've reached their pinnacle. They've allegedly reached their zenith. They are in power. They are king and queen, and yet they are utterly unsatisfied by it, both of them. So the idea that, you know, is this our first indication of what an awful king that Macbeth is going to make? Yeah, I mean, apart from that, he obviously murdered the rightful king in the first place. So that's key. But I also think another key scene that strikes me is Act 4, Scene 1, because they make a big point when the apparitions appear with the witches. There's a sense that, you know, two of them involved. You know, there's the parade of kings, so that he knows that despite everything that he thinks he's doing, actually it's still going to be Banquo's descendants that are going to be future kings. And of course, there's the apparition wearing the crown representing Malcolm, and the idea that Malcolm, you know, but Macbeth clearly doesn't realize this, but there's that kind of subtle foreshadowing of, you know, he's being told one thing on the surface, that it's fine, you know, as long as Birnam Wood doesn't come to Dunsinane, but actually, you know, there's a baby wearing a crown. We might be able to infer that that's representing Malcolm and his future kingship. So that's a useful one. And then we go above the line. So in green, I've decided to do these in separate colors just to really make them distinct. My extract taken from Act 4, Scene 3. This little, interesting by my spelling of Malcolm is quite interesting, so ignore that. There's no random U at the end. Malcolm and Macduff, they're discussing what does it mean to make a king. The whole thing is the whole Malcolm testing Macduff to see, you know, unlike his father, you know, the contrast between the two. He wants to test Macduff, check where his loyalties lie, you know, and Macduff's bleed poor Scotland response shows that actually he's loyal. Malcolm showing that he's a more shrewd individual, showing that he understands, you know, the thing that's useful if you do get that scene for kingship is it tells you, oh, here are all the things that make a good king: verity, stableness, temperance, etc., virtue, and so on, lowliness, meaning humility. And that just gives you your perfect framework. If you were to get that, you've got the perfect framework to be like, wow, we've had this set out to us. Here's our perfect listing of all the qualities of a good king. And then you can evaluate Duncan and Macbeth against those, and Malcolm against those kind of qualities. So that's a really good one. If you do get that scene, at least, you know, the question sounds a bit scary, but actually you're very likely to get that scene if you get that. And then I said, you know, as I said before, I want to think about the context of this scene within the entire play. I've said it lights the fuse for Act 5. So we've been given this kind of model from Malcolm. This is what kingship should be. This is what it should look like. And then we can compare that vision to what actually happens in Act 5. So we get very soon after that, we get Macbeth basically abandoned by all his followers, acting with great aggression and tyranny to those that are left. His main supporter left is a servant called Satan. Feels like it's not a coincidence. Seyton, yes, but come on. And he's treating his servants terribly, calling them cream-faced loons. That's a really good one to show how he has really not been a good king, and that his treatment of people, his actions have driven people away. And then, of course, most obviously, the restoration with Malcolm at the end becoming king. And, that's got that nice link, as I said before, with this sense of catharsis, sense of the natural order of being restored, the fact that he wants to immediately reward people for all the things that they've done, and henceforth he makes the Thanes earls, so this sense of that everybody's immediately got a reward for what they've done to protect their country, and they're going to restore all the exiles and so on. So this is essentially, as I say, this is a revision version, so this is more detailed than you'd get time to do in an exam. But then, of course, you take this, and this will be a really good basis for you to then just think, okay, what are my key arguments going to be? What are my key paragraphs going to be? I've kind of indicated this already. I think if you get a question on kingship, you're probably most likely going to do a Duncan, a Macbeth, a Malcolm. It just makes perfect sense. Certainly the most sophisticated will do that, because the temptation is to just go Macbeth, 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 good king. I don't know where the evidence would be for that, but Macbeth, bad king. More evidence, Macbeth, bad king. That's going to show real limitations. If you do it like this and you think, okay, I'm going to pick these key moments out of here. What are my kind of 2 most important things I can say about Duncan? What are my 2 most important things I can say about Macbeth? What are my 2 most important things I can say about Malcolm? Analyze them, bring in everything else, and you've got a fantastic essay there, and you're going to do really, really well. So that would be my recommendation. Now, let me change over my slide. Drink. Now, this is my 3-minute scribbled down like a maniac version. All right, so this was imagining a new question. How does Shakespeare present the theme of deception in Macbeth? Okay, and I thought, okay, what line, go for it. And again, thought about it, got all my boxes. You know, you can see this is not as clear as my original version, but I'm trying to make it, as I say, as authentic as possible. So I'm thinking, okay, where are the key moments of deception? Again, there are lots of them. So I started by drawing my boxes and thinking, okay, well, very early on, you know, Macbeth's ambition starts to surface underneath, like he's not sharing it with the world. He has lots of asides where he's whispering about things, and then obviously later soliloquies, stars hide your fires, not like see my black and deep desires. You know, this is a step over, you know, Prince of Cumberland, a step over which I must fall down or else overleap. You know, why does the image, you know, when it actually, but even Act 1, Scene 3, when it says, when, you know, the image unfix my hair, you know, the fact that he has that instant reaction to what the witches are saying to him means he's already been thinking about the possibility of being king. They are just, they're mining at an open seam, to use a terrible, outdated metaphor there, but there's a sense that he is easy to manipulate because he's already got this idea in his mind. It's not that they've taken from, you know, a blank slate Macbeth and put this idea in his mind and poisoned him. He has that ambition already, right? And he is already thinking deceptively, he's being secretive right from the beginning. So I think that's key. Of course, my second thing that comes up to me straight away has got to be Lady Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 5 with her soliloquy, you know, and also, of course, from Scene 6, her, you know, act like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. You know, all those lovely bits from Act 1, Scene 5, the idea that she's secretly trying to build herself up to be, you know, in service of these murdering ministers and so on. And of course, the way she acts to Duncan, I almost think there's too much to go at in this question. It's more about limiting what you want to go at. But the horrible, obsequious way that she is with Duncan, she's like, oh, all our service, twice done, double, that kind of flirtatious, kind of over the top. I'm going to do absolutely everything for you to make you comfortable, whilst in the background, dramatic irony, they're going to murder him, you know. Perfect example. And of course, right, back to our extracts, we're back above the line. Say we've been given the dagger soliloquy. It's possible. It has come up before. It's unlikely, but it's possible. You never know. You might be lucky. So the key about this scene is he's not only talking about deceiving others, he's deceiving himself. And of course, he's being deceived by the witches, arguably. If your line of argument is that the dagger is not just an emanation from his hallucinating brain, and that it's actually the witches themselves leading him on to the murder, you could talk about their deception there, about how they're the puppet masters, that they are manipulating him at every stage. Fine. What would I focus on? Is this a dagger I see before me? Clearly, you know, it's screaming out that rhetorical question for you to really pick it apart. The Tarquin's ravishing strides, I always love that, because that really shows his potential for evil and how far he's come just since Act 1, Scene 7. You know, horrible example of a Roman general that killed and raped people, essentially, you know, indiscriminately in war. The idea that he's comparing himself, you know, he wants to creep stealthily towards his goal like Tarquin, you think, ooh, that's not pleasant. So it really shows you the levels of deception that he's willing to go to. You know, he wants himself to be quiet like a ghost so he can sneak in and murder Duncan with ease. Obviously, he talks about pale Hecate's offerings, so you can talk about, you know, he's thinking about the witches, they're in his head, they're still deceiving him. The heat oppressed brain, the idea that, you know, he even considers the fact that maybe he's just got a bit feverish, you know, he's been through a lot, maybe this is all a hallucination. He knows he might be deceiving himself, but he then still acts anyway. He doesn't think to himself. By this point, in Act 1, Scene 7, he was thinking, okay, I'm not going to do this. But now he's thinking, right, I've screwed my courage to the sticking place. You know, we're not going to fail. Let's get on with it. So it's quite a transformation. So it's a really interesting one if they do give you that as an extract to explore. What else can I talk about? So just one minor quote, Act 3, making our faces visitors to our hearts. The reason I like that one is because of the contrast, because obviously it's Lady Macbeth that really is initially saying to Macbeth how important it is that he is subtle, disguising his true feelings. She talks about his face being a book that men may read, all this kind of stuff. But it's interesting, the shoe is on the other foot for most of Act 3. It's Macbeth telling Lady Macbeth, come on, put on your game face, you mustn't reveal us. So it's that interesting change of who's the key deceiver. By Act 3, you know, be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck. He's hiding things from his wife, he's deceiving her, he's hinting, but he's not telling her what's really going on. So that's interesting. And then, of course, prophecy scene, Act 4, Scene 1, the key area of equivocation, the witches' prophecies, all this stuff about, you know, oh, you don't need to fear anybody of women born, you'll be fine. Obviously, we know that Macduff was from his mother's womb untiny ripped. This is just a misleading use of language, which is what equivocation means. And again, you know, you'll be fine till Burnwood comes to Dunsinane Hill. Oh, okay, the trees are moving. They've cut down the trees. Oh dear, I'm screwed. Okay, so it's just, again, a great example of deception and the way the witch is able to use it to manipulate Macbeth. All right, so having said that, I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, how on earth do I limit this down? What am I going to do? You know, and my feeling was I sort of went back and forth on this a little bit, but I thought, okay, well, really, I've got three main areas here. I've got, again, Macbeth, and I can link that in with Tragic Hero and his ambition and how his ambition leads him to embark on all these deceptions, what leads to his downfall. You can talk about Lady Macbeth's deception through manipulation, you know, of others, but also, you know, her husband, but also Duncan. And then, of course, you talk about the witches, manipulation and equivocation. So what are my key scenes? Obviously, I've got to talk about the extract in some detail, aiming for, you know, 40 to 50%, I mean 50% technically, but 40 to 50% of your answer. You've got to really, you know, have a go at least 3 quotes, I'd say, from that extract, maybe 4. So be careful on that. But what are going to be my other key areas? Well, I thought it's very important to show, you know, Act 1, Scene 4, because that's what instigates, you know, the downfall of Macbeth. But it's really important also to show Lady Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 5/6. And then I guess the next most important thing is going to be the prophecies in Act 4, Scene 1. So the good thing here is I've got a range of characters I'm covering. I've got a range of scenes I'm covering. So that, you know, I'm ticking all the boxes. But really, you know, this is quite scruffy, as I've said. And this is really, I wanted to show you, as I said, I would love to have done it live, but I wanted to show you my thought process. And then I thought to myself, okay, fine, Act 2, Scene 1, going back to what we said at the beginning, is this an instigating moment, a culminating moment, a concluding? For me, I think in a lot of ways, it's a culminating moment because it's the culmination of his own personal thoughts, but also the manipulations and deceptions of the witches and Lady Macbeth. All of those things culminated together to make this new monstrous Macbeth that is ready to murder the rightful king, the good king that he acknowledges, you know, that he's supposed to bar the door against the murderer. You know, he's the host, but he's going to do this anyway. So this is a culmination scene for me. And as I said in the earlier part, I would build this idea into my introduction. And also I'll be talking about it within my main paragraphs. Goodness me, we've been going for a long time. I have no idea how long we've been going for, so I apologize for however long this is. I'm just going to plow on and it'll be fine. Yeah, and I've already talked about the fact that the purpose of this whole method is to just get away from just, oh, look, paragraph 1, 2, 3, and think, okay, I want to see where my extract fits in within the whole. It's again encouraging you to think more structurally, encouraging you to think more chronologically, and I think that's incredibly useful, and to encourage you to use these terms like instigate, culminate, conclusion. Woo. Right, sip of tea. Right, final one, actually probably the simplest one, so that's good, because I think that middle one was quite a lot. So do feel free to go back and ask me questions, have a look over that in your free time. So I just cannot stress to you how useful this is. These are just complex sentence writing frames, some of which you may be using in class already. Some of these I just came across again, as part of my research, and I thought, oh my goodness, why have I never used this before? This is just genius. Because those of you who've had me will know that I teach these writing stems for complex sentences, but I'm always focusing on although, whereas, etc. Which the problem with those is they're inviting you to see different sides of something. What if you want to reinforce something? Well, these first two are really focused on that idea. All right. So if you want to say, take two big concepts simultaneously, not only this, but also this, it allows you to talk about these two complex things at the same time. You see my example there. I've made up a pretend kind of comparative comment on unseen poetry. All right, powerful sense of ire, but undercuts with a sense of nostalgia. So I'm analysing my unseen poem. The part of the reason I really like this, as you see on the left-hand side in the margin, it's just so useful because it's basically any piece of writing. I was thinking, oh, I can do it for this, I can do it for that. How can I use it? I can use it to compare. I can use it to find differences and contrast. I can sequence things and think about them in order. I can emphasize particular things. So not only this, but also this. I can use it to conclude, to round up as part of conclusion. I can use it as part of my introduction. And then what questions can I use it for? Almost every single one you've got left. Clearly the comparative element of language paper 2, question 2 of 4. Actually, also I've put this on the later side, but also question 5, because these kind of complex sentences are the lifeblood of a really great piece of persuasive writing. So it's going to be useful there. It's going to be really useful for comparing the two unseen poems. And of course, it's going to be useful for bringing in these big concepts from Macbeth. So there's a huge number of ways you can use these. So, this is a case of you can just go away and use these writing frames and just do lots of practice sentences. My suggestion would be go back to your booklets, have your vocabulary grids in front of you and think about, okay, how many of these sentences can I write using these different frames, and just do it and do it and do it and do it, and think about, oh yeah, that one I can build into a whole thesis. That one I can really use for this particular essay. It's just a really useful practice, and you don't have to, if you're not in the mood to write whole essays, this is just something you can do lots of individual sentences and then think about how they connect together. Relatedly, love the word simultaneously. That should be simultaneously, comma, I will add. See, this is what happens when I jot things down and then realize afterwards, simultaneously, comma. X conveys this while also exploring Y. So again, allowing you to see, to balance, to have in your hand two things simultaneously, allowing us a tiny bit of sympathy for Macbeth, but also giving us that sense of order being restored. So that thing, the idea that a writer can do two things at the same time, because of course they can. That's one of the things that makes them a great writer. They're not just doing one simple thing at any one time. And this is a sentence frame that allows you to explore those multiple ideas. Yes, I've got two here, but theoretically you could do more than two. It's just obviously, being careful to keep the sentence still readable so that it makes sense. But that's a nice one. So simultaneously, at the same time, X conveys this to us as readers, but also conveys and explores that to us as readers. So that's a lovely one. I like that. Whew. So These ones, as I say, a little bit more familiar, but I think useful. All right. So all those are brilliant. One, it forces you into writing a complex sentence. It means you're starting with a subordinate clause all the time. So it's going to be followed with that comma. And then I like ultimately is a great word, particularly in your conclusion. You know, what is the ultimate point of this? Why is this significant? Why am I even talking about it? You know, I like this example. This is a really useful example of a conclusion. Although Macbeth is initially presented as a fearless soldier, perfectly molded to Scotland's warrior culture, his bloodlust and underlying ambition ultimately to his tragic downfall. Whole conclusion done, perfectly encapsulating what I think is the kind of purpose of the character of Macbeth and what happens to him. So I really like that as an example. So ultimately is a lovely word to use in lots of different contexts, but this, you know, conclusions in particular. Relatedly, despite or in spite of a really useful, these are much more contrasting as opposed to the previous one where we looked at, there was a lot more sort of looking for similarities and things we could pick out together. Nuance, you know, again, students of mine have heard me go on about nuance a million times. Useful not only for Macbeth, you know, again, you know, Shakespeare's characters would not still be things that we talk about today and that we quote endlessly. You know, not, you might not even realize you're doing it, but there's various times, you know, there are people in the media described as being a Lady Macbeth character. There's a reason that these characters remain in our head, is because they are complex three-dimensional characters with multiple sides. You need to be acknowledging that. So can we have some sympathy for Lady Macbeth? She is living in a highly hierarchical, patriarchal, medieval society. She is not, you know, seen as someone who can use any violence. She's surrounded by big, burly Scottish men with swords. What is she going to do to achieve her ends? Of course she's going to use manipulation. Of course she's going to use language. Of course she's going to use her feminine wiles, because they're the things that she has at her disposal. It might seem more dishonest and deceptive, but what the heck else is she going to do? You know, maybe she could pull out, you know, a dagger from somewhere, but what is she? Come on. As I say, lots of big, brawny Scottish men. It's not going to happen. What can she use instead? Her words, her sexuality. That would be my argument. I just think it's a more interesting reading of Lady Macbeth rather than, oh, it's all Lady Macbeth's fault. If it wasn't for her, none of this would have happened. That's just an overly simplistic reading of the play, and I think misses a huge amount. So look for that nuance at all times is my suggestion. Whew, I'm running out of energy, but it's good. We're near the end. Hopefully you're still with me. Okay, so 2 final ones. All right. Similarly, again, these are ones that are looking for contrast areas, you know, acknowledging one thing on the one hand, but then also acknowledging something on the other hand. While this, it must be acknowledged that. Whereas this, it becomes clear that, you know, really useful for chronological stuff as well. You know, whereas initially this, at the start this, at the outset this, it becomes clear by Act 3, it becomes clear by the end, it becomes clear by the end of the poem that the tone has changed to this. So that, again, that it's that structural, these are all allowing you not only to be sophisticated, but to think structurally, to think big picture. All right, really, really incredibly important. And I've given you 2 examples here, but I've noted that I've given you my second example is a language paper 2, question 5, just to show you, you know, a sophisticated, nuanced view of social media and its positives and negatives. Again, important, useful structure for doing that. And just to point out, you know, the Macbeth example again, the witches sometimes are talked about in a very one-dimensional way in essays. You know, it's again, oh, it's all their fault. It's Lady Macbeth and the witches. You know, if not for them, Macbeth would have, you know, been fine. They were the arch manipulators. They had the power. Blah blah blah. But actually, they have a lot of limitations to their power. We have this seemingly very odd little thing with, you know, the wife refuses to give chestnuts to the witches, therefore they curse her husband, the sailor, so that he can't sleep, and because basically they make, you know, his bark be tempest tossed, so his boat's going to be really rocky. Great. But they can't actually, oh God, my cat's trying to get in now. Brilliant. Shush, Teddy, I know it's been a long time. yeah, they can't directly injure or kill others, right? At no point do they do that. They have to use what's at their disposal. Again, you know, apparently magical, but they have these limitations as to what they can actually do. So it's really important. They are not omnipotent. They are not godlike forces. Yes, they may be seen as worshippers of the devil that draw power from the devil, etc., therefore having all these negative connotations in the Jacobean society, but they are not godlike figures. They have limitations, and you need to acknowledge that if you're going to give a nuanced response. And I think I've talked about this last bit. Why do we do all this? Of course, hopefully you can see these are all long, complex sentences where I'm holding multiple high-level concepts at the same time. It's adding complexity, but it's showing thought as well. Perceptiveness, ultimately what that means is you've just really thought about this and you've come up with your own interesting, bold ideas. You've gone for it. You've put it all out there. It's never a good idea to play safe. I'd far rather you just go for it and think, oh, okay, yes, fine. The surface meaning might be implied this. However, one could interpret this way, all right? Always, you know, that's what, again, these complex sentences are good for this. Acknowledging multiple interpretations, you know, it could be argued this is much more important than saying, yeah, that means that. That's not going to work, right? Simply, you know, this means this, move on. You're missing the real layers of complexity and interest. And of course, these improve your quality of communication. You just sound cleverer and like you know what you're talking about, which you do, of course. I'm not saying you don't, but this is such a simple way of making you really, really obviously know what you're doing. Be confident. Okay, goodness me. Goodness knows how long this has been. A long time. I hope it's recorded because it would be quite upsetting if it hasn't, because it's taken a long time. But there we go. So thank you and good luck. You know, if you've got any more requests of anything you'd like me to go through in terms of revision, that was just 3 key techniques. We had the brain dump, we had the visual chronological mapping, then we had the complex sentence structures. 3 things that took me a heck of a lot of time to unpack. Do give me an email if you want to, or leave me something on Google Classroom if you're, you know, obviously in my own group. I'd love to hear your thoughts because I want to see if this is useful and if I can do more, if I can, when my daughter's not taking up all my time. But she's delightful, don't get me wrong, but she's at nursery today, and it's a lot easier to film videos when she's not here. Brilliant. Take care of yourselves. Good luck. You are amazing. Just remember that. You are very, very capable young men, and I'm quite sure that you will absolutely smash it. Au revoir. Oh, hello. Press the wrong button. No? There we go. Cheers.